Hello YouTube, how's everyone doing? It's Professional here. Welcome back to my playthrough of Black Ops 1. I hope you guys are enjoying this series. If you are, drop a like. We got a lot of history to discuss on this part. We're doing Victor Charlie. Search for evidence of Soviet presence within the villages of northern Vietnam.
Hudson's mission at Kowloon was accomplished. He had discovered Dragovich's endgame, Nova 6. A nerve toxin so deadly that if exposed, you'd be dead before you hit the floor.
Dragovich's weapon.
Go back to Vietnam, Mason. Was Victor Reznov still with you after you escaped from the MACV compound?
Reznov was with me the whole time.
Are you sure?
North. We went north. Vietcong. We were shut down, and Reznov even survived that. Dragovich's lapdog Kravchenko was there. He knew we were coming.
Davis, you still with me? Davis, come on, Davis, talk to me! Frank, you okay? Shit! My leg! I'm bleeding! I need some help here!
He's dead.
They're coming!
Kill those bastards.
We gotta get out of here! This thing's about to... We're going under, Mason!
One thing, if you notice right here, how did Reznov get out of the helicopter?
21, 10, 16, 23, 4, 22, 21, 4, 0, 14.
One of my favorite parts now.
Stay sharp, Mason. They're out there. This is Lima 9 X-ray.
Left flank, Mason! On the reach!
Head ahead. Take cover.
There we go.
Sergeant Woods is very capable. You have chosen your men well, Mason. I will move to high ground to look for Kravchenko's compound.
Understood. Stay close, Victor.
Lima 9 or X-ray. This is Whiskey. You out there?
Yeah, Whiskey, go.
Woods. Thought we lost you in that chopper. What's the new plan?
You clear the southeast perimeter and meet us at the rally point.
Roger. Whiskey on the way. Over. Glad you're still in the game, Woods.
Okay, so now we talk about exactly what's going on here. These guys that you're fighting right here, they are the Vietcong. And the Vietcong, they are nicknamed Victor Charlie, which that's why also known as VC. That's why the name the name of the mission is called Victor Charlie. It's the first mission where you really encounter the Vietcong. And what were the Vietcong? The Vietcong were an insurgency group that their members were mostly from South Vietnam. Some of them were from North Vietnam, but most of them were from South Vietnam. Some of them were from Cambodia and Laos, but most of them were from South Vietnam. They were South Vietnamese communists that were supporting North Vietnam in its invasion of South Vietnam, and they were basically launching attacks on the South Vietnamese army, South Vietnamese civilians, and the U.S. Now, about the Vietcong, there's a big misunderstanding in history where people think that the Vietcong were like freedom fighters or they were good guys. They were fighting again for the independence of their country. Blah blah blah. What I will say about this is, I'm not here to justify America's involvement in the Vietnam War. I've already said before that I think it was a mistake the U.S. had gotten involved in the Vietnam War. But just because it was a mistake that the U.S. had gotten involved in the Vietnam War, just does not make the Viet Cong the good guys. That's what people think. People think that just because, you know, it was a stupid war getting involved, that the Viet Cong are somehow the good guys in this situation when they're not. So you could be, you know, completely against the Vietnam War, but if you think that the Viet Cong are like, you know, freedom fighters, you think that they're heroes, you think that they're good guys, I really don't know what to say to you. I don't want to call you stupid, but I really honestly don't know what to say to you. The Viet Cong were a terrorist organization. That's essentially what they were. They were a terrorist organization. And if you want a perfect example of what the Viet Cong would do, in 1965, you had the My Can bombing, which happened in Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam. This is the same year that the U.S. had fully started getting involved in the war. The U.S. had started sending advisors to Vietnam in the years beforehand, but 1965 is the year of the war that they had fully gotten involved. Now, My Can, this was a floating restaurant in Saigon. This is a picture of it right here. What the Viet Cong did was they took 2 mines, and those 2 mines, they electronically wired them to go off in the restaurant. They left them in the restaurant, and the mines went off. And why did they target this restaurant? They targeted this restaurant because this is a restaurant where a lot of American soldiers would eat. And now, when you think about it, they didn't care about all the civilians that were in the restaurant. Their only thing they cared about is they cared about hurting the American soldiers that were in the restaurant. They did not care about all of their people, the Vietnamese, who were eating in the restaurant. Now, how many people did they actually kill when those mines detonated in the restaurant? They killed 30 people. 9 American service members, and a few of them were South Vietnamese police and also South Vietnamese civilians that were located in the restaurant. So 9 American servicemen, and then the rest were South Vietnamese police officers and also South Vietnamese civilians that were eating in the restaurant. So they saw their own people, civilians, eating in this restaurant, and because this was a restaurant that was frequented by American soldiers, they thought that they're going to put a bomb in here and detonate it, and they didn't care about the killing their own people as long as they targeted the American soldiers. And there's actually a very famous picture of after this bombing where you actually have a girl who was who became an orphan as a result of this. So her mother actually died in this explosion, her Vietnamese mother, and she was meeting up with her friend, who was an American soldier. I don't know if they were dating or not. That I don't know. I wasn't able to find that out. But I know that her mother was meeting with her friend, who was an American soldier, and both of them ended up dying in there. The child ended up surviving, and the child was actually picked up by an American advisor, which you see in this picture. And the guy who actually died, the soldier who died, who was meeting her mom's friend, actually ended up adopting her and her sister and took them back to America. And that child is actually still alive today. She actually lives in New York today. But she has extreme PTSD and stress from the events of that day. I cannot imagine going through something that traumatic. And also for people that say that, oh, you know, what if the U.S. did it just to make the Viet Cong look bad? The Viet Cong admitted to the bombing. They actually admitted to it. Radio Hanoi, which was the North Vietnamese propaganda, they actually called the attack a glorious exhibit. And they actually said this. This is what the North Vietnamese Communist radio said. You can get killed here. Get out while you're still alive and before it's too late. And this right here goes to show you with just how violent and how evil the Viet Cong were. If you were not a supporter of the Viet Cong, they saw you as fair game. Even if you were not working with the South Vietnamese government, if you were not working with the Americans, if you just were not in favor of the Viet Cong, they didn't care. You were fair game for them. In that exact same year, in 1965, the front of the U.S. Embassy was actually bombed. And there was a car that had 300 pounds of plastic explosives. They killed 2 Americans and 1 CIA agent. And about this, 19 Vietnamese civilians and 1 Filipino that was actually serving in the U.S. Navy died. So they killed 19 Vietnamese civilians, and they also injured 183 people. They put that bomb on a busy street in Saigon just because it was in front of the U.S. Embassy. So they wanted to target the American soldiers that were in front of the U.S. Embassy, and they didn't care about all of the other people that were there. So why are the Viet Cong so violent towards their own people? Well, the reason that the Viet Cong are so violent towards their own people is the exact reason why communists are so violent. So throughout history, you had so many different communist countries, from the Soviet Union, you know, communist China, you know, communist North Korea, you know, communist Cuba, you know, communist Vietnam, communist Laos, communist Cambodia, you know, communist Mongolia, you know, communist Angola. You know, you can just keep going down the list. And communists have just engaged in such violence and such horrific acts against their own people, just like this. And the reason that communists do stuff like this is because communists believe that they are on the right side of history. They are so into their ideology that communists believe that anybody who does not support communism is evil. That is how a lot of communists think. They think that if you do not support communism, that you are evil, that you are supporting, greedy capitalists who are exploiting the working class, exploiting the proletariat. This is why communists throughout history are so violent and so ruthless. They believe that anybody who does not support communism threatens their utopia, threatens their perfect world, and that person must be killed. And when it comes to these civilians, like the Vietnamese civilians who died in the restaurant, the Vietnamese civilians who died on that busy street in front of the American embassy, how the Viet Cong look at it is they say, oh, these were Vietnamese people who were not resisting the Americans. They weren't resisting the quote on imperialist Americans. They weren't fighting for North Vietnam. They were not supporting communism. They were not resisting. They had a duty to resist against the American imperialists, blah, blah, blah. And because they were not resisting in the way that they wanted them to, they were eating in a restaurant with, American soldiers, they were targets. Because the people on the street were living in the capital city, not resisting the Americans, that they had an embassy in their capital city, those people were fair game. And this is why communists are so violent throughout history, because they see anybody that does not support their revolution, that goes against their utopia, as evil. They think that anybody that doesn't support their utopia is evil. They will lie, cheat, do anything to engage in violence, anything to basically get to power. That is basically how it is. They think that they're on the right side of history, and they think that their ideology and their cause is just, and they think that anybody who disagrees with them, even people who don't directly fight against them, people who disagree with them, are evil, are against their perfect utopia, and they will basically resort to violence to, keep that utopia and protect that so-called utopia. So that's basically it. And I will say this also about communists, is communists are the most effective at creating propaganda. Throughout history, communist propaganda has literally been the most effective. There's a lot of, disgusting, evil dictatorships that have existed throughout history, but the communist propaganda, I would probably say, is the most effective at brainwashing people. Because what communist propaganda does is it specifically targets class. It targets everybody who is poor. It says, why are you poor? Why are you, why don't you have more money? Why don't you have land? It's because, the capitalists are exploiting you. The capitalists are exploiting the working class. They are evil. They are stealing from you. Even though communists themselves don't believe in the right of owning land, they will constantly tell peasants, why don't you own land? So you see how that is? They don't even believe in the private ownership of land, but they will tell peasants all the time, and poor people, why don't you own land? It's because the capitalists, even though they themselves don't even support the ownership of land. So that is what they will do. Is communist propaganda is so effective because it takes advantage of people who are poor and basically has them blame all of their problems on the economic system. There are other problems, sure. But to blame all of the issues on capitalism, this is ridiculous. And I will say this, is that if you look at any first world capitalist nation, people always have had way better lives than they have in any communist nation throughout history. And even if you take a look at, Korea is a perfect example of this. Both North Korea and South Korea were dictatorships. So North Korea is still a dictatorship to this day. South Korea was a dictatorship, I think, until the late 80s or the early 90s. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But what happened was North Korea's economy was actually growing faster than South Korea's economy, and their economy was actually bigger than South Korea's at one point. And what a lot of communists will do is they'll point to Korea as an example, and they'll say, oh, the reason that North Korea's economy was bigger than South Korea's was because communism was a success. Oh, Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, he was doing a better job than the South Koreans. The reason that North Korea's economy was bigger than South Korea was because North Korea had received aid from two superpowers. It received aid from China, and it received aid from the Soviet Union. When it came to the Sino-Soviet split, that's when China and the Soviet Union went against each other. North Korea took a neutral stance. They didn't take a side in that conflict. And so because of that, they were taking aid from both China and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was building up a lot of their stuff. For example, you had the Vietcong hotel in North Korea, which that was a hotel that was actually largely being funded by the Soviet Union. A lot of Soviet aid was funding that hotel. But then what happened was when this Soviet Union collapsed and the money stopped coming in, that hotel stopped being constructed. And even though the outside of it is finished, the inside is still abandoned today. It's the largest, abandoned building in the world, I believe, is the Vietcong Hotel in North Korea. And then North Korea went through a famine in the 1990s because of that. So literally, the only way that communist countries could function like that is because they were being funded by the Soviet Union and they were being funded by China. And it was the same thing with Cuba. Remember what I said in the first part when I was talking about Cuba? When the Soviets were buying sugar from Cuba, they were paying over 10 times the price of sugar for Cuba. So why would the Soviets pay 10 times more for sugar in Cuba? It's because they were trying to keep the Cuban economy afloat. The Cuban economy was about to collapse, and the Soviets had largely funded it. That is why. And if you look at, countries like Vietnam and countries like China today, the reason that countries like Vietnam and China today have not fallen apart is because Vietnam and China both went through free market reforms. Vietnam went through free market reforms in the I think it was 10 years after the Vietnam War, and then China, went through free market reforms in the 1970s. And so these countries are still largely controlled by the Communist Party of Vietnam and Communist Party of China, but they have gone through free market reforms, which has actually grown their economies a lot. If you look at, countries that have closed themselves off, you look at North Korea and you look at Cuba, you have both countries with a very closed off economy, both controlled economy, no free market whatsoever, and both of their economies have been a disaster. Going back to Korea now specifically, the reason that's, South Korea wasn't as big as North Korea because South Korea was not being funded as much by the US as North Korea was being funded by China and the Soviet Union. Then what happened was that when the money stopped coming in from the Soviets especially, a lot of the Chinese stopped pulling out and they stopped sending money to the North Koreans as well. And what ended up happening is South Korea became a flourishing democracy in the 1990s. Their free market system has worked. They've built up their economy. South Korea is an economic giant, and now South Korea's economy, I think, is over $1 trillion, and North Korea's economy is not even worth $100 billion. So literally, that is how much more powerful South Korea's economy is than North Korea. But that's basically it. It's just been a disaster every single place it's tried. And look, I know that capitalism is not a perfect system. I know that there's issues with it, but it's just like my college professor once said. He said capitalism is not a perfect system, but it's far better than any other system that has been tried throughout human history. And now, going back to the Vietcong, I wanted to talk about just how evil this organization is and the attacks that they have done. So there was one village, the Tan Mai massacre. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But this was a village that was located in central Vietnam. It was part of South Vietnam at that time. Now about this village is this village had supported South Vietnam, did not cooperate with the Viet Cong. And if there was a village that did not cooperate with the Viet Cong would destroy that village, and they would kill a lot of the people in that village, kidnap people, extort the village. So the Viet Cong would terrorize villages that would not cooperate with them. And the Viet Cong would claim, we're fighting for the poor Vietnamese, farmer peasant, but yet they would terrorize and attack any kind of village that did not cooperate with them. And this is a perfect example of that, the Tan Mai massacre. The Viet Cong actually used white phosphorus when they attacked this village, burned a lot of buildings to the ground. And people actually ran into bunkers to take cover. The Viet Cong actually burned them out of bunkers. If people came out of the bunkers, they told them they wouldn't be hurt, they shot and killed them. And then the other people that were in the bunkers, they would throw grenades in the bunkers, they would burn people alive in the bunkers. It was horrible. They killed over 74 civilians and injured 160, and they destroyed hundreds of homes, 156 homes that they destroyed. Then you had the Dak Son massacre, which happened in 1967, and this one, the Viet Cong murdered over 252 civilians. I talked about this on my Hue City part, but the Montagnard people, they were an indigenous people that had lived in Vietnam, and both North Vietnam and South Vietnam hated them. The reason that they hated them is because these people largely wanted to be independent of Vietnam. They actually wanted their own autonomous zone, and so both North Vietnam and South Vietnam did not like them. The Americans trained a lot of Montagnard people to be able to defend themselves from the Viet Cong. They really did not like the Viet Cong, and the Viet Cong went into this one village with flamethrowers, and they burned people alive in their homes, killing 252 civilians. And what happened is afterwards, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese government, and even Vietnam to this day, claims that the Dak Son massacre was actually committed by Americans. They claim that American planes had actually bombed the area, napalmed the area, but civilians who had actually survived the massacre say it was the Viet Cong who came into the village with flamethrowers and burned people alive in their homes. This was a village that was basically razed to the ground. 252 civilians murdered. You got another one. You got the Son Tra massacre. This one happened in 1968. 88 civilians killed, 103 people injured. And again, this was the Viet Cong going into a village that was largely allied with South Vietnam. They didn't like that this village was supporting South Vietnam, and so for them, all of the villagers, all the civilians in the village were basically fair targets. They went in the village, they were targeting the village with mortars, bombing the village, they were throwing satchel charges into buildings, blowing houses up with people inside out of them, destroyed the village, and they destroyed 570 homes and left 2,800 people homeless. And then you also have something like this. You have the shelling of Kailai schoolyard. This happened in 1973. They were actually shelling a school. They were shelling a school with mortars. And this is the part when the U.S. really started pulling out of the Vietnam War at this time. By 1973, there's very few American soldiers left in. And so what the Viet Cong would typically do is they would typically blame America. So whenever they committed any kind of massacre, they would typically blame America. They would say, oh, it's America or South Vietnam. In this case, they could not blame America because America had largely pulled out of the conflict. And so what they did was they had blamed South Vietnam instead. And about this bombing, why would they do something like this? Why would they bomb a schoolyard? The reason that communists targeted schools is because they saw schools as a place where there would be kids of the upper class would be in them. This was a government-run school in South Vietnam, and they basically said, oh, this was a, school that is indoctrinating kids into, South Vietnamese, pro-imperialist American ideology, and so they saw all of the kids as their targets again, bombed the schoolyard. And look, if you want even more proof on just how vicious the Viet Cong is, Wikipedia has like an entire page of just literally 15 years of just massacres that the Viet Cong had committed. And on the Wikipedia's page, it says that somewhere between 100,000 to 227,000 people were murdered by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army during the Vietnam War. Now, I know people are going to say, is Wikipedia really reliable? Wikipedia is reliable for the most part. That's where I get a lot of my history knowledge from. And Wikipedia actually shows sources. It shows sources at the bottom of every page. You can see the sources where they had gotten their information from. Yes, there are occasionally when there are mistakes on Wikipedia. Wikipedia, for the most part, is a pretty reliable source, and I personally like it as my, favorite source for reading history. But you can just take a look at this. If we just take a look at the first, everything from 1960 to 1964, this is largely before the U.S. had gotten involved in the Vietnam War. U.S. got involved fully in 1965. But just look, 1960, February 2, VC sacked and burned the Buddhist temple at Pho Rat Tant, Tay Ninh province. They stabbed to death 17-year-old Phan Van No, who tried to stop them. So basically, is that, and you see what communists will do is they had basically, what the communists had done is they had spread propaganda against South Vietnam, and they had said that the South Vietnamese are discriminating against the Buddhists, which is true. The South Vietnamese were discriminating against the Buddhists. The Ngo Dinh Diem's regime had terrorized the Buddhists, but the communists themselves had also terrorized a lot of Buddhists, but they leave that part out. So they will do stuff. And then they themselves will accuse the other side of doing it as well. And then you had April 22, some 30 VC raid Doi Long and Xuan province, an attempt to abduct a farmer. A 16-year-old boy was shot dead. What was the purpose of this? What did the 16-year-old boy do? Was the 16-year-old boy like an American soldier? No, he wasn't. August 2nd, the VC executed 2 men at a school in Rao Ran Phong Dinh province. September 24th, 1960, the VC sacked a school in An Lac and Giang province. September 28th, the VC stopped a car carrying Father Hoang Nong Min, a priest of Kontum Parish, killing him and seriously wounding his nephew who was driving. The reason that communists would target religious leaders is because communist regimes throughout history have promoted state atheism. So this is different than secularism, where secularism is this idea that there's no state religion. All religions are going to be basically treated equally by the government, and the government stays neutral in religious affairs. That's the idea of secularism. State atheism is not the same thing. State atheism is where the government basically says, there is no God or gods. This atheism is correct, and they will basically force it on everybody. I'm an agnostic myself personally, but you cannot force religion on people. Whether you're forcing religion or you're forcing atheism on people, you can't do something like that. People have a right to practice whatever faith that they want. And so communists would see religion as being in line with capitalism, and they would see religion as a way to basically control the proletariat, control the working class. That's why the communists oftentimes hate religion. Karl Marx himself said that that religion is the opium of the masses. So that is where the communist ideology, the communist hate for religion comes from, specifically from that. You have September 30th, Trong Van Dang, 67, from Long Trin, Long An province, was taken to a people's tribunal. He was condemned to death for purchasing 2 hectares of rice land and ignoring VC orders to turn the land over to another farmer. After the trial, he was shot dead in his rice field. So you got a guy who was purchasing land. He purchased land, and they shot him dead over that. December 6th, the VC dynamited the kitchen at the Saigon Golf Club, killing a Vietnamese kitchen helper and injuring 2 Vietnamese cooks. And what did that do? What did that do to fight for Vietnam's independence exactly? Killing a cook literally killing a kitchen helper and injuring 2 cooks. What did that do to advance Vietnam's independence? Exactly. 1961, March 22, a truck carrying 20 girls was dynamited on the Saigon-Vong Tao Road. After the explosion, VC opened fire on survivors, killing 2 and wounding 10. Again, May 15, 12 Catholic nuns from La Providence Order were traveling on Highway 1 towards Saigon. Their bus was stopped by VC near Tram Van, Tay Ninh Province. One of the nuns was killed after protesting. July 26, 2 Vietnamese National Assembly men, Ram Pak and Yet Nick Bornit, both Montajards, were shot and killed by VC near Dalet. A school teacher traveling with them on their first visit to Montajard resettlement village was also killed. And they targeted 2 politicians, but they also killed a school teacher with them. September 20, 1,000 main force VC soldiers stormed Phuoc Vinh, capital of Phuoc Tan province, sacked and burned government buildings, and beheaded the administration staff, cut their heads off. They held the capital for 24 hours before withdrawing. December 13th, Father Bonnet, a French Paris priest from Konkala Kontum, was killed by VC while visiting parishioners at Nak Ronje. December 20th, Phuket, a Japanese engineer at the Dan Nim hydroelectric power station, a Japanese government war reparations project to supply electric power to Vietnam, was kidnapped after being stopped at a roadblock and never seen again. What was that Japanese engineer doing? The Japanese engineer was there to help run a power plant that was helping to give power to the people of Vietnam. And what did that Japanese engineer deserve? What did he do to deserve something like that? And then you look at this. 1962, January 1st, a South Vietnamese labor leader, La Van Thieu, 63, was hacked to death by VC, wielding machetes near Bien Hoa in the rubber plantation on which he had worked. So this guy was a leader of workers, but he was supporting South Vietnam, and they can't have that. They cannot have a labor leader that is not pro-communist. If there's somebody that's a labor leader, a union official that is not pro-communist, that person is an enemy for them as well. January 2, 2 South Vietnamese technicians working in the government's anti-malaria program, Phan Van Hai and Nguyen Van Thac, were killed by VC with machetes 12 miles south of Saigon. 2 technicians helping to fight malaria were killed just because they were working for the South Vietnamese government. February 20, VC threw 4 hand grenades into a crowded village theater near Can Tho, killing 24 women and children. In all, 108 persons were killed or injured. My God. April 8, the VC executed 2 wounded American prisoners of war near the village of An Chau. Each hands tied was shot in the face because he could not keep up with the retreating captors. And this is the thing. If you were a prisoner of war, if you were a South Vietnamese, American, or Australian prisoner of war, and you were taken by the Vietcong, your chances of survival were almost nothing. You had almost no chance of survival. If you got taken by the North Vietnamese army, at least you would still probably get tortured, but you at least had maybe a chance of surviving. But if you got taken by the Vietcong, you had almost no chance of surviving. They would abuse prisoners, torture prisoners, cut off limbs, extremely brutal. May 19, a VC grenade attack on the Atbara restaurant in Saigon wounded a German circus manager and the cultural attaché from the German embassy. Why? How does that help, how does that help to secure Vietnam's independence? May 20, a bomb exploded in front of the Hung Dao Hotel, Saigon, a billet for American servicemen, injuring 8 Vietnamese and 3 Americans who were in the street at the time. So again, because there's Vietnamese people that are near American soldiers, they see, oh, these people were not resisting. They were not fighting against the Americans. They were collaborating. They're traitors to Vietnam. They're traitors to the working class. So in their eyes, they deserve to get targeted too. May 20, May 30th, the VC kidnapped missionaries Dan Gerber, Archie E. Mitchell, and Dr. Eleanor Ardell Vitelli from the Buon Ma Duet Leper colony. They were never seen again. They kidnapped several missionaries. They killed them. You didn't see them. So again, they would target religious leaders all the time. June 12th, the VC ambushed a civilian passenger bus near Letri An Jing province, killing 5 men and women. October 20, a VC threw a grenade into a holiday crowd in downtown Saigon, killing 6 persons, including 2 children, and injuring 38 people. November 4th, VC threw a grenade into an alley in Can Tho, killing 1 American serviceman and 2 Vietnamese children. A 3rd Vietnamese child was seriously injured. 1963, January 25th, the VC dynamited a passenger freight from train near Quy Noron, killing 8 passengers and injuring 15 others. March 4th, 2 Protestant missionaries, Elwood Forreston, an American, and Gaspard Maciel, a Filipino, were shot dead at a VC roadblock between Saigon and Dalat. Mackey's twin babies were shot and wounded. They even shot the babies, but it seems that the babies had survived. March 16th, the VC threw a grenade into a Saigon home where an American family was having dinner, killing a French businessman and wounding 4 other persons. April 3rd, 1963, the VC threw 2 grenades into a variety show performance at a private school near Longzuyen, Anjiang province, killing a teacher and 2 other adults. April 4th, the VC threw grenades into an audience attending an outdoor motion picture showing in Chaolon village in the Mekong Delta, killing 4 persons and wounding 11. May 23, the VC mined the main northern rail line, killing 5 civilian passengers. 12 other passengers and crew were injured. May 31st, 2 explosions set off by VC on bicycles killed 2 Vietnamese and wounded 10 others in Saigon. September 12th, Voti Lo 26, a school teacher in An Phuoc, Kien Ho province, was found near the village with her throat cut. She had been kidnapped 3 days earlier. October 16th, the VC exploded mines under 2 civilian bases in Kien Hoa and Quang Tin provinces, killing 18 civilians and wounding 23. November 9th, 3 grenades were thrown in Saigon, injuring a total of 16 persons, including 4 children. February 9th, 1964, 2 Americans were killed and 41 wounded, including 4 women and 5 children, when a VC bomb was set off in a sports stadium during a softball game. A second bomb failed to explode. What is that to do exactly? Is that fighting for Vietnam's freedom and independence by detonating a bomb in a stadium during a softball game? February 6th, 3 Americans were killed and 32 injured, most of them U.S. dependents, when the VC bombed the Kennedy movie theater in Saigon. July 14th, Pham Thao, chairman of the Catholic Action Committee in Quang Nal, was executed when he returned to his native village of Pho Lai, Quang Nal province. So literally, I'm not going to keep reading this because there's an entire list of this, but that was from 1960 to 1964 alone. And now you still got 11 more years of just massacres and just terrorism that the Viet Cong had committed. So this, just to basically explain this, the Viet Cong are a terrorist organization. I don't know, like, after I've explained this and I've really covered all of this, how could somebody not think that the Viet Cong are a terrorist organization? They were killing their own people. Most of these attacks were on civilians. These weren't even on American soldiers. They were literally killing their own people. They're targeting, terrorizing their own people. And again, the U.S. fully got involved in the war in 1965. So yes, we did have some American soldiers and thousands of advisors then, but 1965 is when we fully entered the Vietnam War. And so you had years before that, they were terrorizing their own people, attacking religious leaders, attacking, civilians, terrorizing villages, kidnapping people constantly. And people say that the Viet Cong are freedom fighters. Now, what ended up happening to the Viet Cong? In 1975, the Vietnamese Communist Party actually abolished the Viet Cong. They had actually voted to shut it down. And they merged the Viet Cong with the Vietnamese Fatherland Front, which the Vietnamese Fatherland Front is it's a coalition of socialist and communist parties that support the Vietnamese Communist Party. So that was basically it, is that the Viet Cong were hoping for a position in the government. They were hoping that they would be high people in the government, that they would have a lot of power after the war, but they didn't. They didn't get that power. Instead, what the Viet Cong were to the North Vietnamese is they were useful idiots. That's what we would call them. They were people who had fought thinking that they would be rewarded heavily when North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam. It did not happen. Instead, they were disarmed, and their movement was abolished. And also, a lot of people said that the reason that the North Vietnamese had supported the Tet Offensive is because they wanted the Viet Cong destroyed during the Tet Offensive, so that when North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam, they didn't have to worry about any kind of resistance or any kind of violence from the Viet Cong. So that was basically it. The Viet Cong were useful idiots to the North Vietnamese, and then when the North Vietnamese took power, they disbanded their group, and they didn't even give them all these rewards, all these top positions in the government. Instead, South Vietnam was being controlled still by people from the North Vietnamese government. But that's basically it. And I know I'm getting a little emotional about this here, but I'm just gonna say I'm just a bit pissed and I'm just a bit annoyed because look, I don't want people putting words in my mouth. I don't want people saying that, I'm some supporter of the Vietnam War. I have made my position clear. I have said before that I don't think we should have gotten involved in the war. I think it was stupid to get involved in the war. But just because, it might have been a dumb idea to get involved in the war does not mean that the Viet Cong were good people. And the thing is, when I see these stupid comments on YouTube, I see these dumb comments, I'm reading comment section on Vietnam War videos, and I see these people saying, the Viet Cong were freedom fighters. They fought against American imperialism for a free and independent Vietnam. The Viet Cong terrorized and killed anybody who didn't agree with them. They terrorized and killed their own people. Literally, all of those bombings, everything that I've read to you guys right there, how could anybody say that the Viet Cong are like freedom fighters? So that's personally just pisses me off about the Viet Cong are the worst of the worst. Is that it literally, they were way worse than North Vietnamese. They were just a terrorist organization. That's exactly what they were. No freedom fighter is ever going to terrorize their people. A freedom fighter will never terrorize their people. They will never kill innocent people. They will fight for the freedom and independence of their nation. They will never terrorize and kill innocent people. That's not what a freedom fighter does. But the Viet Cong, they are not freedom fighters. They are terrorists. That's essentially what they are.
The rally point is just ahead. Bowman should be waiting for us. No noise, knife only.
When Mason says Charlie, that's a term for VC forces.
Charlie.
Never gets old.
Mason, fill us in.
Somewhere near this village is a military outpost under the command of General Kravchenko.
Been losing our FAC to AAA.
Probably a ZPU. We'll disarm it, then we'll bring in the Hornets. Whiskey team, you cover the bridge in East River. Mason with me on the west perimeter. Rendezvous point, the village, in 5 minutes. You got it?
Whiskey team, on me. Later, boys.
Destroy a ZPU. The ZPU is a Soviet anti-aircraft weapon.
Cleared the east bank, moving to the bridge. Sierra's at the north perimeter.
Anh dụng câu mà không có mối. Anh hợp tha không. Nhỏ căm, canh câu trúng trơn luôn. Em thân khổ. Thôi thôi hả? Cá còn khôn hơn anh nữa. Nó một anh láng xào lão màu đá thì cáo mòn cáo nào rồi.
He's saying, you kill him, I'll kill the other one.
X-rays clearing the west flank. ETA 3 minutes. We gotta split up. I'll take the high ground. You cross the river, find a place for the Semtex.
Roger.
Explosives are primed and ready.
Sierra in position. Whiskey ready.
Roger. X-ray inbound. You got that detonator?
Right here.
Oh, this is gonna be good now.
Put a little present in the fuel reserve up ahead.
All right. Mason, let's see what this Semtex can do.
Go, 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 go! Weapons free! Keep your eyes open for that ZPU! Enemy down! Keep your head down! Let's go, Mason! On me! Contact on the roof! Drop him! We're clear! Move, move! Mason, get in position! Eyes left, Mason! Take those bastards out! Roger that! Good work! Spider hole, dead ahead! Grenade in that spider hole! Frag out! 1-0, this is Whiskey! We got CPU on the river! Mason, move it, brother! Charlie on the right! Let me more firepower! Take it out! Just free up that 202 flag! Hit that CPU on the river! Damn it! Mason! Get to that 202! I'm pinned down! Next to the hut on the river, you see it? Charlie don't want to let that gun go! Look at those fuckers move! Mason! Use the 202!
This is like a meme right now from this mission when Bowman keeps saying, Mason, use the 202.
Mason! Use the 202!
That it's
Mason! Use the 202! Mason! Use the 202! Mason! Use the 202!
Okay, I think Bowman wants me to use the 202. Okay.
All right, let's hit it!
Can't even get up for a second to shoot them.
Got it! 1-0! Nest is empty, objective clear!
Roger. Lima 9 or X-ray. This is Kentucky. Green Hornets inbound. Keep your shit tucked. We are coming in hot. Sierra's at the north perimeter. Sierra's cleared the north perimeter, moving to the village.
Left flank, targets on the roof!
Position.
Got it. He's down! You're taking fire! Someone drop a nade in the hole! Tango down! Nice work!
He's down!
Reloading, give me cover! Take cover! Grenade!
Dock is clear! Move up!
We're gonna cut through this hut. Mason, lead the way. Mason, over here. Clear the rest of the village. MG, take cover! Push through! Let's go! Mason, make sure that hooch is clear. Rat tunnel up ahead.
I see it.
Charlie, 9 o'clock!
He's dead!
Rat tunnel up ahead.
I see it.
Fire in the hole!
We have to clear this tunnel.
I'll take it. Swift, with me.
All right. I'll get the Hornet scouring the area. Let's move.
Lima 9, this is X-Ray. Prep for recon sweep, 3K radius.
Roger that, X-Ray.
Here, take this. Stay on it. We'll find your Kravchenko. We'll make it out of there alive. Bowman, point. Let's move.
Oh, there we go. Okay, now, oh man, I gotta talk about these tunnels now here. Ooh, this is, so, basically, the tunnel rats. The tunnel rats, this was a real type of soldier, and this was a nickname given to soldiers who would basically go into these Vietcong tunnels, and they would clear them out. And these soldiers oftentimes had a sidearm with them. They had a they sometimes carried a 1911, which was a very common American sidearm in the Vietnam War. But the 1911, it fires 45 ACP. It's a pretty powerful cartridge, and if you're firing something like a 1911 in those really close tunnels, that's gonna, you know, make you deaf or really hurt your hearing. And so soldiers, a lot of times, what they like carrying is they like carrying actually 38 revolvers, or they would carry also 22s. Sometimes they would carry 22 handguns down there, which a 22 is not going to be, you know, that loud, especially in that kind of environment. But about the tunnel rats, here's actually something that you might not know about the tunnel rats. The tunnel rats actually, the first tunnel rats actually were not American soldiers. The first tunnel rats actually were Australians. And this is what a lot of people don't know. Australia was actually in the Vietnam War, and they were actually helping the US out. So Australia sent around 60,000 soldiers to help the US during the Vietnam War. Australia helped the US a lot during the conflict. And New Zealand also sent 3,000 soldiers. Now, why was Australia and New Zealand in the Vietnam War? Australia was concerned with communist expansion in Southeast Asia. And, you know, when Indochina, that's the region where, you know, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam is, if that region fell to communism, there'd be greater communist influence in the region. And Australia doesn't really want that, because they're not that far from it. And then the Australians thought it was going to push down the Malaysian, Indonesia, and then it was going to threaten their country. And so that's why Australia had joined the Vietnam War to help the US. The New Zealand had a smaller force, around 3,000 troops. New Zealand actually didn't want to get involved in the war. They didn't actually want to help in the war, at least the government didn't. But the reason that New Zealand did end up helping the US in the Vietnam War is because they believed that if Australia had helped the US in the war, that Australia would have gotten special treatment over New Zealand by the US. So the US would have been more pissed at New Zealand in the future. And so that was basically it, is that they didn't want to alienate the US. That's why New Zealand also sent like 3,000 soldiers to help the US in the Vietnam War. But you have the Cu Chi tunnels, which the Cu Chi tunnels, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, these are one of the largest tunnel networks in the Vietnam War. I think these might be the largest ones. They're actually, right now, they are tourist attractions in Vietnam, which are very popular. And the Cu Chi tunnels are located in South Vietnam. And they were used heavily during the Tet Offensive, which we saw I talked about in the Hue City part. But about the Cu Chi tunnels, these tunnels actually trace their roots all the way back to the First Indochina War, which is when the Viet Minh fought against the French. So when France tried to colonize Vietnam and they tried to conquer Vietnam, these tunnels were used by the Viet Minh to actually fight against the French. And a lot of these tunnels that were throughout the war were actually dug during the First Indochina War. And the thing about these tunnels is that the tunnels that you see in Black Ops 1, they're not really walled in, but a lot of these tunnels actually were made out of concrete, and they were actually almost built like bunkers. And these tunnel networks were huge. You know, they were massive. So a lot of these tunnels would stretch for miles and miles and miles. And the thing about them, they had multiple entrances and exits, and a lot of times they would go into somebody's house. So they would either open up somewhere in the jungle that the Viet Cong were familiar with, or they might pop up into some a Viet Cong supporter's house. So they actually there might be like a tunnel entrance inside like a house. And these tunnels were so well done. They had field hospitals down there. They had barracks. They had armories. They had cafeterias down there. And the thing about these tunnels, The Australian troops actually did try to clear out the tunnels during Operation Crimp. So the U.S. and Australia and New Zealand forces did try to clear out the Coochie tunnels, but they were only partially successful, and we weren't able to fully clear out the tunnels, and the tunnels were actually used for a huge portion of the war again. Now, why were we unsuccessful in clearing out the tunnels? Now, I know some people might be thinking, why didn't we really have this in World War II? Because the Japanese dug tunnels also in World War II. They did. But in World War II, you didn't really have like a specific soldier unit that would go into these tunnels in these Japanese tunnels in World War II. I mean, you kind of did, but it wasn't as well known as the tunnel rats. And the reason that it didn't really happen in World War II in the Pacific as much, it did happen, but the reason it wasn't as common as in Vietnam was because the tunnels the Japanese dug were a lot smaller and they were actually easier to destroy. Because, for example, one of the biggest tunnel networks the Japanese had was during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and the tunnels were largely in the mountains in Iwo Jima. And one of the reasons that we were actually able to clear out those tunnels easier is because we shelled Iwo Jima. We shelled it so much that there was no trees left. And so these tunnels protected some of the Japanese, but a lot of tunnels were actually destroyed during the shelling of Iwo Jima, so we were able to just bomb the area and bomb it and bomb it and bomb it. And then what happened was the remaining tunnels, the tunnels weren't as built as well as the Vietcong tunnels. We were able to actually send flamethrowers into those tunnels, and the flames would just basically clear out the tunnels, and any Japanese soldiers that were inside the tunnels would run out because of the smoke, and they would either get captured or they would get shot when they exited the tunnels. That's why the tunnels in World War II, the Japanese tunnels, were a lot easier to clear out. The Viet Cong tunnels, on the other hand, because they were just so sophisticated, they had so many entrances, so many exits, and the Viet Cong had prepared for everything. They were ready for everything. When they fought against the French, they were prepared for everything that the French would use. The Viet Cong made a lot of the tunnels built like bunkers, so they would withstand artillery, they would withstand bombings. The Viet Cong also had multiple ventilation systems in these tunnels. So Americans tried to get the Viet Cong out of the tunnels with tear gas. We tried to gas the tunnels and tried to get them out with that, but that wouldn't work either because the ventilation systems that they had in those tunnels, they were built like in a specific way that the tunnels were actually gassed. All of the gas would just go in one direction, get out of the tunnel, and then the Viet Cong could actually retreat to another part of the tunnel that was not getting gassed. So that was the reason that gas wasn't effective. The reason that bombing wasn't effective on these tunnels, like I said, some of the tunnels were built like bunkers, but also on top of that, it was bombing tunnels in World War II was very different than bombing tunnels in the Vietnam War. And the reason for that is because when the Japanese dug tunnels to fight against us in the Pacific War, the tunnels that the Japanese had built were on isolated, very far islands. You had Iwo Jima, Saipan, Tarawa. These islands had very little people on them, and a lot of times the civilians were not in the area where, if there were civilians on these islands, they weren't in the area a lot of times where the Japanese had dug the tunnels. But sometimes the Japanese would actually use Korean slave laborers to actually build some of the tunnels, and some of them did die due to American bombings on a lot of those Pacific islands. But that's basically it. Is a lot of these tunnels that the Japanese built, they were not near civilian areas, and we knew where the tunnels were. The Viet Cong tunnels, on the other hand, we didn't know where all of them were. We didn't know where they stretched out to. And because these Viet Cong tunnels were all over the place, they were in a jungle, it was very hard to find the entrance and exits to these tunnels. And a lot of times these tunnels would actually lead into villages, and they were right near civilian areas. And the Viet Cong knew this very well. And so they basically used the civilians as shields as well. And so we can't really bomb the areas as much as like during World War II, because we're going to kill a lot of civilians. In 1970, the U.S. started a carpet bombing campaign against a lot of these tunnels, and a lot of these tunnels had gotten destroyed, but also a lot of civilians had gotten killed as a result of that. So that was the reason we couldn't bomb a lot of the tunnels, at least for a number of years, was because there were so many civilians that were in the proximity, and we didn't know exactly where the tunnels were. We couldn't gas them out because of the ventilation system, and also the same thing with the fire. We could not use flamethrowers in these tunnels because of the fact that these tunnels were so well built, they were so well designed, they were designed to stop fires. They were designed like in specific turns and patterns. It would stop fire, it would stop gas. There was really no way that we could get them out of those tunnels. It was just so many factors, and that's basically where the tunnel rats come in. And about the tunnel rats were actually first called. They were one of the Australian commanders that was actually in the campaign in Operation Crimp, which was to actually shut down a lot of the tunnels. Sandy McGregor, his troops actually went into the tunnels and became basically the first tunnel rats. And about them is they were actually called tunnel ferrets by him. but an American reporter who actually didn't hear that correctly started referring to them as tunnel rats, and tunnel rats became a lot more popular as a term instead of tunnel ferrets. But that was basically it. That was why we could not, we had to send people into the tunnels, was because we could not get them out of those tunnels. Like I said, they built the tunnels so well, it was better than the Japanese had built a lot of their tunnel networks. You know, a lot of them were built like bunkers. They were well ventilated, and they were basically prepared for gas. They were prepared for flamethrowers. They were prepared for bombings. They were basically prepared for everything. And so really the only way to clear them out is we actually had to send people in the tunnels. And I will tell you something, being a tunnel rat is the worst job that you can have in the Vietnam War. It is by far the worst job. You could not pay me $1 billion to go into those tunnels. Never. And also, the people that would be chosen into those tunnels would oftentimes be small soldiers. So you wouldn't have a choice. They would choose you, and it would be a smaller soldier. Usually soldiers that were a little bit over 5 feet. Soldiers that were closer to 6 feet were not chosen for that. Maybe if they were skinny, but it was a lot of times, soldiers that were, bigger, were not chosen, with skinnier, shorter soldiers that were oftentimes chosen to go into those tunnels because of the maneuverability. But that's what I will say is that these tunnels, oh man, that was such a bad job. Honestly, I personally think that the chances of you surviving will be better if you were a flame trooper. Like, if you actually had a flamethrower troopers had a less chance of one of the highest, chances of death in, like, wars. But honestly, I think that being a flame trooper would actually be better than being a tunnel rat, because it was just so dangerous. And the thing about this is, because the soldiers were at a massive disadvantage, because the enemy knew that they were coming towards them, and they were using flashlights. And the thing is, the Viet Cong soldiers had memorized the tunnels. They knew them so well, even in the dark. And so a Viet Cong soldier could just basically wait down the tunnel. They could just be prone, laying in the ground on the tunnel, and they could just be pointing their AK right down the tunnel. They see, like, around the corner, they see a light coming down, like a soldier with a flashlight. The soldier with the flashlight has no idea what's ahead of him, and then the second the Viet Cong soldier sees the flashlight, they don't even need to see the soldier. They just see the flashlight. They'll just spray their AK in the direction, and the soldier will die. And so that's it, is you're coming in with a flashlight, they're hiding in the darkness, they're waiting for you, and it's not even the fact that you could get ambushed in the tunnels, it's also the fact that these tunnels were full of traps. The Viet Cong would put punji sticks in a lot of these as traps in these tunnels, and the Viet Cong knew where the traps were, so they could avoid them. They had grenades that were tripwire grenades that were in these tunnels, would blow you up. The tunnel would cave in on you. You had the punji sticks. Punji sticks, what they basically were is they were like wooden, sharp bamboo sticks that were covered in feces. And the reason that they were covered in feces is because if let's say that an American soldier stepped on a punji stick, right? You would basically get your foot impaled by that, but because of the feces that was on the punji stick, your wound would now get infected with so much bacteria. So much bacteria would go directly into your wound, and that was almost a death sentence. So even if you stepped on a punji stick, or you just stepped your boot into it and it actually went into your foot, actually cut open the inside of your foot, because of all the feces that were on, the bacteria would just get into your blood, get into your system, and then you would get a really bad infection and you would die. It was a really painful death. You get a fever. It was a really, really horrible way to go. And so that was it, is that even like stepping on a punji stick could just be a death sentence because of all the bacteria that would basically get into you. So arguably, you could argue that punji sticks are technically a form of biological warfare because they were using feces on the punji sticks. Technically, you can make the argument that it was a form of biological warfare. And the Viet Cong, what they would also do is they would dump poisonous snakes in the tunnels, and the Viet Cong would oftentimes have fake tunnels that would go nowhere and would actually lead to a trap. So there would be one tunnel that they would fill with just nothing but poisonous snakes, and they would have like a few different tunnels, and you would go in the wrong tunnel. They knew which was the right tunnel to go into. You went into the tunnel with the snakes, and you'd be dead. They'd kill you. So that was it. This was honestly like one of the scariest things that you could do as a soldier. And honestly, I would say being a tunnel rat is one of the scariest forms of jobs ever in human history. When it comes to warfare, it's like literally the top 10 scariest military jobs that you could have throughout human history. I think that being a tunnel rat will probably be on one of them. Like I said, you could not pay me $1 billion to go in these tunnels. Like, hell no. I'm not gonna do something like that. It's like the chances of you surviving are just so slim, doing something like that. So for anybody who actually does something like that, you have to be a very, very brave person. Very, very brave and very, very courageous person to go into those tunnels. And I will say, for people that every single person is going to be scared going in those tunnels. Even the soldiers that are literally the most toughest guys, even they're going to be scared. Everybody. And even Mason, when you hear Mason's voice when he's going actually through the tunnels in this mission, Mason is actually terrified when he's actually going through the tunnels. You actually hear his voice, and you can hear that Mason is visibly, scared actually going through the tunnel. You have to understand, Mason was also SOG. He was MACV SOC. So Mason was Special Forces. And even though Mason is Special Forces, even he himself is actually terrified going into those tunnels.
Oh, Reznov, you nearly took a bullet.
No one fights alone, Mason. I will work my way around.
All right, but move quietly.
What the fuck's wrong with you? Mason, you gotta keep your shit together.
What's coming?
Go ahead, Mason.
Swift's dead. We got VC crawling all over.
Human area, keep in the area.
What? You monitor. Shit.
So this is exactly what I mean with the this is exactly what I mean with just how scary the tunnels were. Stuff like this could happen. Somebody could jump out at you at any moment.
Where is your friend Swift?
Dead.
We will mourn him later, Mason. There are signs of Soviet presence in these tunnels. We are on the right path.
One thing, if you notice, the
Here! Help me move this.
the guy that Reznov killed, if you notice one thing about him, no blood coming out of him, but you shoot these guys, blood comes out. What does that mean, though? For anybody who plays the game, you know what that means, but I'm showing a little hints of stuff that's to come.
Careful, Mason. I hear the enemy. Your
This one,
turn,
blood's
my
coming
friend.
out.
I will follow.
Now you decide which way to go.
We are getting close, Mason.
Which way, Reznov?
Follow your instincts, Mason.
Son of a bitch!
This is it. Grushenko's forward compound.
It looks abandoned
Grushenko anticipated our arrival.
and left in a hurry.
February 4th, 1968. The stabilizing agent supplied by Dr. Clark.
Quick, grab the documents,
have
Reznov.
met
We're
with
leaving.
success. Recent field tests on the local population. Thus far. As with tests at rebirth. The onset of symptoms in human subjects is exactly in line with our expectations. Within 30 seconds of inhaling the gas, subjects experience sudden and severe pain, quickly followed by a significant drop in blood pressure, leading to fever, nausea, and vomiting. After 60 seconds, blistering of the skin begins, followed by scaling, peeling, and discoloration across the subject's entire body, effectively signaling the onset of epidermal necrosis. At this stage, we have had limited success, by way of aggressive surgical debridement, in keeping subjects alive for short periods. But even the surgical removal of infected tissue is not enough to prevent further spread. While the speed of infection appears to be consistent across adult males, we have observed a more aggressive rate of decay within infants, usually leading to mortality within 30 to 45 seconds. We have every indication that we now have a workable formula which is effective, even in warmer climates. Communicate our successes to Dr. Steiner. Kravchenko out.
Go! Go! Kravchenko had the place wired to blow. X-ray, do you monitor? Damn it!
Harry Mason! I do not wish this rat hole to become my grave!
This is one of the worst
What happened? We're seeing fire from the
worst
tunnel.
ways to
Where
go.
the hell are you? We'll maintain a holding pattern until we have eyes on.
We will have to claw our way out of here! Dig, Mason! Dig!
Shit!
VC, Mason!
Where are you, Woods? Come on, come on!
Let's get the fuck out of here.
Confirmed that Dragovich is second in...
Okay, guys, so I guess we will wrap this up here. Thank you guys for watching this part. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I will have the next part out for you guys as soon as I can. Thank you again. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, guys.